Hi, my name is Bernhard and I work in the research field called gene hunting, where we try to understand what our DNA actually does. So even though the human genome was fully sequenced more than 20 years ago, we are still far from fully understanding it. In fact, we don't even know how many genes humans exactly have. And I like to explain this process with a simple analogy where imagine you're holding a watch and you want to understand how it works and which parts of it are essential. And so you remove one part, and if the watch still works, then this part probably wasn't that important. But if you remove another component and the watch stops working, then you know this was an essential part of it. And researchers use a similar approach in biology, where for decades we have studied animals like mice by deleting individual genes and looking at what happens to these mice, if they have any changes in their development or their behavior or the immune system, the field that I'm working in. And in humans we use a different approach. So instead of deleting individual genes, we look for patients who show signs of a dysfunctional immune system, which can have often an underlying genetic cause. And so these patients typically get sick repeatedly from a very young age, often even as newborns. And as a genetic disease, there's often a family history of family members that show similar characteristics and symptoms. So when the clinicians encounter such cases, they contact us and send us blood samples from these patients and their relatives. We isolate the DNA and the immune cells to study them. And here it's important to note that if you look at the DNA of any individual, everyone has thousands of genetic differences, and these are completely normal, typically. So the challenge is to find the few changes that can actually cause a disease. And so far, researchers have identified more than 500 gene defects that can all affect the immune system, but there are still many more out there to discover. And one such case was my PhD project, where we studied patients who all had similar symptoms, including the recurrent infections, basically since birth. And what was very striking about them is that they had a very low number of antibodies and fully matured B cells, the type of immune cells that produce these antibodies. So we sequenced the DNA and we found that all of these patients, unlike their healthy relatives, had a mutation in a gene called LTBR. And although no disease-causing mutations had been described in LTBR before, it has been well studied in animals, where we know if you delete this gene in mice, they develop fewer lymph nodes. What are lymph nodes? Lymph nodes are a group of small organs that are strategically distributed throughout the body. And when you have an infection, then the nearest lymph node gets activated and acts as a form of military outpost for your immune cells, where they can multiply and complete the development to properly fight the infection. If you ever had a throat or a tooth infection, you might be familiar with this swollen, often painful knots in the neck area, and this is basically just a sign that your immune system got activated. So with this knowledge, we asked the clinicians to perform special imaging techniques that allow us to look at the lymph nodes in these patients, and to our surprise, we not only found a reduction of lymph nodes in them, but there was a complete absence of lymph nodes in the entire body of these patients, and this fully explains the symptoms, because in the lymph nodes, especially the B cells, undergo the final maturation steps to become cells that are able to produce antibodies. And these are exactly the two things that are reduced in these patients. And with this knowledge, we were not only able to describe a new disease and diagnose these patients, but we were also able to improve their treatment. And finally, I would like to highlight that even though these types of genetic immune diseases are by definition rare diseases, so they affect less than 1 in 2,000 people, in accumulation, this accounts to more than 300,000 people in the European Union alone. And with research studies just as this, we not only help to better understand our immune system and help develop new therapies for these patients, but with this knowledge gain, we can also develop therapies for patients with more common diseases.